Have you ever wondered what happens when a fragile body hides an unshakable determination? And what if I told you that the greatest basketball player of all time secretly mentored an athlete no one wanted? Imagine lying on a hospital stretcher, hearing doctors whisper, "He's too good to be cut, but too fragile to lead." Imagine receiving the devastating news that your team tried to trade you and no team accepted. What would you do when the whole world believed your body could never bear the weight of greatness? In 2011, a young Stephen Curry was about to give it all up. With multiple ankle surgeries and his body seemingly betraying his talent, he called his agent with words that almost changed the history of basketball. "Maybe it's time to quit." What Curry didn't know was that, from the shadows, someone was watching. Someone who saw in him something even he couldn't see. Michael Jordan, the man who defined excellence in sports, was about to begin a secret mentorship that would last over a decade and remain completely hidden from the world. "You train like you're hiding," Jordan said in their first meeting. It was only the beginning of a series of cryptic messages that would appear in the darkest moments of Curry's career. Anonymous notes, mysterious water bottles, late-night calls that lasted only seconds. Why would the greatest player of all time secretly invest in an athlete considered too fragile for the game? What did Jordan see in Curry that no one else could? And how did these silent messages turn a near quit into the most revolutionary career basketball has ever witnessed? Get ready to discover the never-before-revealed story of how the greatest legend in basketball became the invisible anchor that held Curry up when the world doubted him, and how in 2025, this secret finally came to light, forever changing our understanding of what it truly means to be great. This is the story of how fragility becomes strength, of how defeats refine heroes. This is the story of the mentor in the shadows. Stephen Curry was driving slowly through the familiar streets of Charlotte, the city that watched him grow up. Through the car window, he observed the neighborhood basketball courts, now empty under the dim light of the autumn evening. The NBA lockout had paralyzed the 2011 season, and he, like all other players, was in a professional limbo that seemed endless. But for Curry, that forced pause carried a different weight. His right ankle, operated on months earlier, still throbbed when pressured too much, constantly reminding him of the fragility that the sports press never tired of mentioning. He slowed down as he passed a faded billboard of the Charlotte Hornets, the team he once dreamed of playing for, but that never wanted him enough to select him in the draft. "Funny how you always come back to where it all started when you don't know where else to go," he murmured to himself, adjusting the rearview mirror just to avoid his own gaze. His mother's house was exactly as he remembered, cozy and immaculately tidy, with family photos all around. Sonia Curry welcomed him with the same tight hug as always, the one that for years had meant protection, but now felt almost suffocating. She tried to hide her concern behind a rehearsed smile, but Stephen knew every micro-expression on that face. He saw her eyebrows tighten slightly when she noticed the way he favored his right ankle climbing the porch steps. At the kitchen counter, between sips of chamomile tea, Sonia tried to fill the silence with questions about Dell, his father, about his physical recovery, about plans to stay in shape during the lockout. Stephen answered with short sentences, monosyllables when possible, avoiding what really mattered, the growing fear that his body was betraying his dream. "The doctor said it's just a matter of time and patience, Mom," he lied with a weak smile, knowing the diagnosis had been far less optimistic. "They always say the same about injuries like mine." The conversation danced like that, in careful circles, for almost an hour, until Stephen finally announced he needed to leave. He needed to breathe far from that silent compassion, far from the eyes that seemed to ask if he was ready to accept the possibility that maybe, just maybe, professional basketball wasn't his destiny. He grabbed the car keys and, almost without thinking, drove to Davidson High School, where he had trained hundreds of times with his father after hours. The old gym, with its peeling paint and the peculiar smell of varnished wood and sweat, was like a time capsule. He stopped at the entrance, breathing in that familiar air, hearing the distant echo of his own memories. Greats returned to their roots not to relive the past, but to understand why they had to leave. he thought, remembering the words his father used to repeat. He pushed the heavy metal door and froze immediately. The unmistakable sound of a ball bouncing rhythmically on the floor filled his ears. Someone was already there. Through the small window in the door, he saw a solitary silhouette performing fluid, almost hypnotic movements at the center of the court. Not just any silhouette. Even from a distance and with poor lighting, he would recognize that profile anywhere in the world. Michael Jordan, the man himself, the man whose shadow loomed over every player who dared to dream of greatness in the NBA. Curry felt his stomach drop. If there was ever a moment to quietly turn around and leave, it was that one. But before he could move, the door creaked, betraying his presence. Jordan paused mid-shot, turning slowly toward the sound. "You gonna stand there spying on me or come in already, kid?" Jordan's deep, authoritative voice echoed through the gym, devoid of any identifiable emotion. Stephen entered awkwardly, limping slightly as he tried to hide the pain in his ankle. He approached the icon with his head slightly lowered, a mix of respect and intimidation shaping his posture. Jordan didn't smile, didn't extend a hand for a greeting, just observed him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to read every insecurity, every doubt Curry carried on his shoulders. The silence between them was as heavy as an unfulfilled expectation. Finally, Michael picked up the orange ball that had rolled to a stop at Stephen's feet and spun it in his hands with the familiarity of someone handling an extension of their own body. "Davidson High, huh? Dell used to bring you here after the Hornets practices. You were too small for those three-pointers, but you already had the wrist," Jordan remarked, with a casualness that contrasted with his analytical expression. "Heard your ankle's giving you trouble." Again. Cold sweat ran down Stephen's spine. How did Jordan know that? News about his injury had been downplayed by the Warriors' medical team. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if standing naked before the man considered the greatest player of all time. He tried to formulate a confident response, but the words simply wouldn't come. Jordan didn't wait. He threw the ball to him with force, almost testing his reflexes. Stephen caught it instinctively, but the sudden movement made his ankle throb, and a wince betrayed the pain. "Pain is temporary. Quitting is forever," Jordan said, crossing his arms. "But you already know that, don't you? Or at least you should." Those words hit Stephen like a slap. For the next 20 minutes, what unfolded was less a conversation and more of a monologue punctuated by Jordan's sharp observations, who seemed to probe every weakness in his already fragile armor. There were no words of encouragement, no praise for his rookie season, not even acknowledgement of his potential. Just raw truths about dedication, resilience, and the price of success. Stephen absorbed it all in silence, alternating between admiration and disillusionment. This was Michael Jordan, the man he had idolized his whole life, speaking to him as if he were just another kid with a dream too big for his skinny body. "You don't understand," Stephen finally found his voice, rough from suppressed emotion. "It's not just the ankle. It's like my whole body is betraying me when I need it most to prove my worth." The gym was now shrouded in darkness, with only a few emergency lights casting long shadows across the court. Jordan had taken the ball back and was executing perfect shots while speaking, as if the conversation required only a fraction of his attention. Stephen watched every movement with the hungry eyes of someone studying a map to a treasure. That's when, in the middle of a sentence, Jordan abruptly stopped and stared at him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his chest. "You train like you're hiding," he declared, with the certainty of someone diagnosing a disease by its most obvious symptom. "Like every move is an apology for taking up space." The words dropped like stones into the still lake of Stephen's consciousness. It was true. Since the injuries, since the increasingly vocal criticism, since his body began to fail him, he had been training defensively, too cautiously, afraid of breaking, as if trying to justify his presence in the league, as if he needed permission to dream. His eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. Not there, not in front of him. Jordan seemed to notice the internal struggle, and for a fleeting moment, something like empathy crossed his hardened features. Without saying another word, he walked over to a side bench where a black sports bag rested, pulled out a manila envelope, and held it for a moment, as if weighing a decision. "I found something you should see," he said, walking toward the exit without looking back. "It's in your backpack." Confused, Stephen turned to check his backpack, which he had left near the entrance. When he turned back to the court, Jordan had already vanished, like an apparition dissolving into the mist. The echo of his footsteps still reverberated in the empty gym, but the man was simply no longer there. A strange feeling took hold of Stephen, as if those 20 minutes had been a hallucination induced by despair. Limping more noticeably now that there was no one to impress, he walked to his backpack and opened it. Inside, among his belongings, was an envelope that certainly hadn't been there before. His fingers trembled as he opened it. How did he put this here? When? He whispered into the silent gym, feeling his heart race. Inside the envelope was a yellowed newspaper clipping. It was a short article about him from when he was still in high school. The headline read, "Dell's son, great shooter or great disappointment." Stephen remembered that report well. It had been one of the first to question whether he really had what it took to follow in his father's footsteps. In the margin of the page, handwritten in black ink, was a sentence that made his heart stop for a second. "You don't have to be seen to be remembered." Traces of an expensive and distinctive cologne subtly lingered in the air around the paper, the same one he had sensed while talking to Jordan. An involuntary shiver ran through his body. The message was crystal clear, even in its enigmatic simplicity. It wasn't about visibility. It wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about leaving a permanent mark that transcended the momentary spotlight. His trembling hands held the paper as if it were a sacred relic as he slowly walked out of the gym, his mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. Why would he care? Why would Jordan waste time on me? He asked himself, unable to comprehend the motivation behind the gesture. The cool night air hit his face as he finally stepped into the parking lot. The lamplight cast long shadows across the empty asphalt, and the silence was absolute. He sat in the driver's seat of his car, but didn't start the engine. His eyes scanned the clipping and the handwritten message again, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue to explain that surreal encounter. That's when he noticed something on the back of the paper, a small stylized MJ, the unmistakable signature of Michael Jordan, followed by a phone number. The implications hit him like a wave. It hadn't been a chance meeting. Jordan had been watching his career. Jordan had a message for him. Jordan thought he was hiding. "Damn," he muttered, punching the steering wheel with sudden rage. "Even Michael Jordan can see right through me." The searing pain in his ankle now felt amplified, pulsing in sync with his chaotic thoughts. The doctor's words echoed in his head. Chronic instability, prone to recurring injuries. Consider alternative career paths. The sports media had already begun writing his professional obituary, calling him a risky investment and too fragile for the modern game. And now this. Michael Jordan, the living legend, showing up like a ghost to tell him, what exactly? That he was hiding? That he didn't need to be seen? The tears he had managed to hold back in the gym finally broke through, silently streaming down his face as he stared at the piece of paper that now felt as heavy as a ton in his hands. Maybe they're right, he thought, feeling the weight of defeat in every cell of his body. Maybe I'm not made for this. With mechanical movements, he took his phone out of his pocket and dialed the number of his agent, Jeff Austin. As he waited for the call to be answered, his gaze wandered across the empty parking lot, imagining a future where he would no longer be Stephen Curry, the NBA player, but just Stephen Curry, the guy who almost made it. The steady ringing of the phone felt like a countdown to his surrender. Finally, Jeff's familiar voice came through on the other end, asking how the family visit was going. Stephen took a deep breath, looking one last time at Jordan's message before folding the paper carefully and placing it in his jacket pocket, close to his heart. "Jeff!" His voice came out choked, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. "Maybe it's time to stop." The rehab clinic in Oakland had that distinctive smell Stephen knew all too well. A mix of hospital disinfectant, exercise equipment rubber, and the sweat of frustrated athletes. 8 months had passed since that night in Charlotte, since the conversation with Jordan, since the desperate call to his agent. Jeff had managed to convince him not to give up, at least not yet. Just one more season, just one more chance, he had pleaded over the phone. And Curry, driven perhaps more by the fear of regret than by hope, agreed. But his body disagreed. 3 games into his return, his right ankle gave out again during a seemingly simple defensive move. Now, after his third surgery in 18 months, he pushed through the double doors of the Warriors Clinic with his chin held high out of sheer pride, while everything else, shoulders, heart, confidence, collapsed inside. The receptionist, a young man who probably once dreamed of watching him play, lowered his eyes when he recognized him, pretending to look something up on the computer to avoid that awkward eye contact. Stephen was already familiar with that reaction. It was the same one he got in the arena hallways, at Oakland restaurants, on social media. Pity, the most humiliating emotion someone can feel for a professional athlete. Funny how you can be in a room full of people and still feel like everyone's attending your funeral, he thought, signing the check-in sheet without looking at anyone. I'm alive, damn it. It's just an ankle. The physical therapy room was packed that morning. At the East End, Andrew Bogut was working on recovering from his own set of injuries. Near the windows, David Lee stretched his shoulder muscles under the close supervision of a physical therapist. Both waved at Stephen with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. It was as if the entire franchise shared a dark secret that only Curry pretended not to know. That signing him had been a mistake. That his body wasn't up to the game. That his destiny was to be just another what-if statistic in NBA history. The coaches greeted him with overly enthusiastic technical instructions, like parents trying to cheer up a child after a devastating loss. Let's start light today, Stephen, said Chelsea, the head physical therapist, as she led him to an isolated treatment table. Her voice was artificially upbeat, as if she were talking to a terminal patient being promised a cure. Your surgeon is very optimistic about the ligament reconstruction. In 6 weeks, you'll be ready to start light impact training. 6 weeks, 42 days, 1,008 hours without doing the one movement that defines who I am, he replied, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. We're counting, aren't we, Chelsea? Lying on his back on the table, with his leg elevated and wrapped in ice, Stephen stared at the clinic ceiling while Chelsea manipulated his ankle with carefully calculated movements. The pain was constant but bearable, a persistent reminder of his fragility. Through the large mirror covering the sidewall, he could see other athletes performing complex exercises, jumping, running, while he remained still, like a grounded ship watching the ocean. That's when he noticed, through the same mirror, 2 familiar figures entering the administrative area adjacent to the therapy room. Bob Myers, the Warriors' general manager, and Joe Lacob, the franchise owner, walked with the silent gravity of executives about to make difficult decisions. Normally, their presence wouldn't be unusual, but the way they briefly looked in his direction before quickly turning away triggered all of Stephen's internal alarms. Chelsea adjusted his ankle at a new angle, causing a sharp twinge of pain. He clenched his teeth but kept his eyes fixed on the mirror, watching the 2 men who practically controlled his professional fate. I think we should slightly increase the range today, Chelsea said, unaware of his interest in the conversation happening on the other side of the glass. Your body is responding well to the passive manipulation. My body is responding, Chelsea, he replied with a bitter smile that didn't match his usual gentle demeanor. Just not the way everyone expected. The adjacent meeting room had glass walls, supposedly to promote the organizational transparency the Warriors' management took so much pride in. But in that moment, that literal transparency became a window into Stephen's personal nightmare. Though he couldn't hear the conversation, Myers and Lacob's body language said it all. Emphatic gestures, worried expressions, occasional glances in his direction. Chelsea continued her work, completely oblivious to the silent drama unfolding just a few feet away. With a sudden motion, Stephen leaned slightly to the left, adjusting his position on the table under the pretext of relieving a back discomfort. In reality, he was trying to find an angle that would allow him to read the executive's lips. It was a skill he had partially developed during years on the bench, trying to decipher coaches' instructions amid the deafening noise of arenas. Lacob was speaking now, his profile sharp against the white background of the room. I won't lie, Chelsea, Stephen said, maintaining a facade of normalcy while his eyes remained fixed on the mirror. There are days I wake up and for a second I forget that my body's betraying me. Those are the worst seconds. The mind heals before the body, Stephen, she replied with the rehearsed compassion of someone who had seen careers in on that very same table. It's normal to feel frustrated, but try to focus on the progress, not the process. The effort to adjust his position without seeming obvious was paying off. Stephen could now catch fragments of the conversation. Myers gestured as he spoke, his body leaning over the glass table, as if the weight of his words were too heavy to stand under. Third surgery on the same ankle, uncertain recovery timeline, contract value considering the risk. Each fragment was like a small stab. But when Lacob spoke again, Stephen felt as if all the air had been sucked from his lungs. Even from a distance, even without audio, the words formed by the owner's lips were unmistakably clear. He's too good to cut, but too fragile to lead. Stephen's stomach dropped, a cold sensation spreading through his chest like ink in water. That sentence perfectly summed up his greatest fear. Being forever the player of wasted potential, the moderate risk investment, the talent that never materialized. Chelsea noticed his sudden pallor and stopped the exercises, asking if he was in pain. He just shook his head no, unable to form words as his world silently crumbled. "I think we've reached our limit for today," Chelsea said, interpreting his expression as physical exhaustion. "You're progressing well, Stephen?" "Really?" "Progressing toward what exactly?" he asked in a faint voice that betrayed the storm inside. "The next injury? The next rehab cycle? The end?" The next 60 minutes were a blur of mechanical drills, technical instructions, and forced smiles. Stephen moved through the rest of the session like an automaton, responding only when absolutely necessary, while his mind remained trapped by that devastating phrase. "Too fragile to lead." The words echoed in his head like a cruel mantra. When Chelsea finally called the session to an end, he felt a momentary relief, immediately followed by the anxiety of facing the locker room, the parking lot, the road home, spaces that had once simply marked transitions and now felt like steps in a painful daily ritual. Limping slightly more out of caution than real pain, Stephen headed to the empty locker room at that time of day. The solitude of the usually bustling space amplified every negative thought. He sat on the wooden bench in front of his locker, staring at the name Curry engraved on the metal plate. A name that carried the weight of expectation since the day he was born as Del Curry's son. A name that now was being rewritten in boardrooms as synonymous with fragility. "Names are just labels until someone proves otherwise," he muttered to himself, opening the locker with more force than necessary. But how can you prove anything if your body doesn't even allow you to try? The body is just a temporary vehicle, Stephen. It's the mind that determines how far you'll go. Stephen spun around abruptly, searching for the source of that deep, familiar voice. The locker room was completely empty. Only the distant echo of equipment being moved in the therapy room broke the silence. Was he hallucinating now? Had the tension and frustration finally pushed him beyond the limits of sanity? He shook his head, trying to pull himself together. That's when his eyes fell upon something that definitely hadn't been there when he arrived that morning. A royal blue water bottle with the University of North Carolina logo, Michael Jordan's alma mater, placed precisely at the center of his locker. Stephen picked it up with trembling hands, examining the object as if it were an archaeological artifact. Around the bottle, a strip of white tape had been carefully wrapped, bearing a handwritten message in black pen. "Endurance is rarer than brilliance." The same handwriting style, the same enigmatic assertiveness, the same almost imperceptible scent he had felt in Charlotte. Jordan, again. "How is this possible?" he whispered to the empty locker room, rotating the bottle between his fingers. "How does he always know when I'm about to give up?" Looking more closely, Stephen noticed something inside the bottle. It wasn't water, but a small, rolled-up piece of paper. Carefully, he unscrewed the cap and tilted the bottle, letting the paper slide into his hand. It was a page torn from a book, yellowed with time. At the top, in small letters, "The Jordan Rules, page 151," and a paragraph highlighted in yellow marker. When asked about the injuries that nearly ended his second season, Jordan replied, "They said I would never play the same way again. I used that doubt as fuel. Silent endurance has always been my greatest weapon." Below the text, a handwritten note. "There is no glory in surrender, only in resistance when surrender is the most logical option." Stephen felt a lump forming in his throat. The message couldn't have been clearer, nor could it have arrived at a more crucial moment. Once again, in some inexplicable way, Jordan had appeared like a shadow along his path, offering not comfort, but the hard truth he needed to hear. "Jordan is watching me," he concluded, a shiver running down his spine. "But why? What does he see in me that I can't see in myself?" That bottle, that message represented something Stephen hadn't received until then. Not the pity disguised as concern from his teammates, not the empty, excessive optimism from coaches, not the cold assessments from executives. It was a raw form of respect, the acknowledgement of his potential from someone who had defined the meaning of greatness. Endurance is rarer than brilliance. Anyone could shine when circumstances were favorable, when their bodies cooperated, when talent met the perfect opportunity. But to endure when everything pointed to giving up? That was truly rare. Stephen carefully tucked the clipping into his jacket pocket, along with the one he had received in Charlotte. Two pieces of a puzzle he still couldn't fully comprehend. Maybe it's not about what my body can do right now, he reflected, feeling a spark of determination ignite amid the ashes of self-pity. Maybe it's about what I'm willing to endure, until it does. With a new sense of purpose, Stephen began getting dressed to leave. The UNC bottle now held a place of honor in his backpack, like a secret talisman. The pain in his ankle was still there. The doubts of the executives still hovered in the air. His future was still uncertain. But something had changed internally. A small flame of endurance had been lit, fueled not by naive hope that things would magically improve, but by the acceptance that the path would be hard, and the conscious decision to walk it anyway. He finished tying his sneakers, grabbed his things, and headed for the exit. The hallway leading to the parking lot was long and sterile, with vinyl flooring that still smelled of freshly applied cleaning product. With each step, Stephen mentally recited Jordan's words, turning them into a personal mantra. Endurance is rarer than brilliance. Endurance is rarer than brilliance. Endurance is rarer than brilliance. As he rounded the corner leading to the main door, Stephen didn't notice the small cleaning cart partially hidden by the wall. A staff member had left a bucket with water and a mop leaning against it, creating a small puddle that spread across the polished floor. Absorbed in his thoughts, focused on maintaining balance on his operated ankle, he didn't see the danger until it was too late. His right sneaker slid across the wet surface like a skate on ice. For a moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. His body losing balance, his arms flailing in the air in a desperate attempt to regain stability, his backpack slipping off his shoulder. The instinct to protect his freshly operated ankle was stronger. Instead of falling directly, Stephen twisted his body in the air, trying to spare his right leg from the impact. But physics is unforgiving. When his body hit the ground, it was his left wrist that absorbed all the weight of the fall, bending at an impossible angle against the hard floor. "No, no, no, no!" he cried, feeling searing pain radiate from his wrist to his shoulder. "Please, not this." The sound of the bone breaking was audible, a dry snap that echoed through the empty corridor. The pain came next, a wave of agony so intense that for a moment the entire world disappeared, reduced to a single point of pure suffering. Stephen rolled to his side, clutching his wrist to his chest as waves of nausea threatened to overtake him. Through the fog of pain, he saw his backpack flipped on the floor, the UNC bottle rolling a few meters ahead, as if observing the scene with the silent indifference of an oracle whose predictions always come true. Resisting is rarer than shining. Now resistance gained a new dimension. It wasn't just resisting doubts, comments, and unmet expectations. It was resisting fate itself, which seemed determined to break him, piece by piece, injury by injury. "This can't be happening," he groaned, as tears of pain and frustration finally escaped, with no one there to witness them in that deserted hallway. Not now, not like this. Lying on the cold floor, clutching his fractured wrist, Stephen Curry stared at the white ceiling of the rehabilitation clinic. The same clinic that should have been fixing his body, not breaking it further. The cruel irony didn't escape him, nor did the devastating symbolism. Now it wasn't just his ankle betraying him, but also his hand, the instrument that defined his one truly exceptional skill, his shot, his left wrist, crucial for the balance and precision that made his three-point shot so lethal. Broken, like a final omen that maybe the universe was trying to tell him something. That maybe it was time to accept the truth everyone already seemed to know. That his body wasn't made for this game. Stephen's apartment in Oakland had always been his refuge, a minimalist and organized space that reflected his disciplined personality. Now, 3 weeks after the wrist fracture, the place looked more like an abandoned cave. Closed blinds blocked the California sunlight, takeout food wrappers piled up on the coffee table, and a stack of unopened mail grew by the door, like a symbolic barricade against the outside world. The white immobilizer on his left wrist stood out like a flag of surrender against the chaotic scene. Sitting on the dark couch, Stephen stared at the turned-off television, the remote beside him as untouched as the light exercise equipment the doctor had recommended to stay in shape. His cell phone, casually thrown on the adjacent cushion, blinked with unchecked notifications. 17 missed calls, 32 unread messages. One of the assistant coaches had come by earlier, knocking persistently at the door for nearly 10 minutes before giving up. Stephen had heard every knock as though they were hammer blows to his head, but he made no move to answer. The silence that followed was almost as painful as the knocks. "They'll give up eventually," he murmured to the empty apartment, adjusting the immobilizer that irritated his skin. "They always give up when things get too hard." On the nightstand next to a half-full glass of water and prescribed painkillers, the small blue bottle with the UNC logo remained like a silent sentinel. Stephen couldn't force himself to put it away, but he also couldn't stand to look directly at it. "Resisting is rarer than shining." Jordan's words now felt like a cruel joke. What kind of resistance was possible when his body shattered with every attempt? The wrist fracture had been the final blow, not just physically, but psychologically. The medical diagnosis was merciless. 8 weeks of immobilization, followed by months of intensive physical therapy. Another compromised season, more time wasted, more proof of the fragility everyone had already suspected. The worst part was knowing that the injury had occurred from a trivial fall, not from a heroic play during a decisive game. The universe hadn't even granted him that. An epic story to justify this failure. Just a wet floor, a moment of distraction, and all the efforts to recover his ankle reduced to nothing in the face of a new problem. What kind of professional player breaks himself walking down an empty hallway? He bitterly questioned, picking up his phone only to silence it again. Maybe my body is trying to tell me something my mind refuses to accept. His apartment, located on the 8th floor of an elegant building with a view of the bay, offered a spectacular panorama of San Francisco in the distance. But the curtains remained closed day after day, as though the beauty of the outside world were a personal insult to the darkness that ruled his interior. The night before, Stephen had rehearsed for the first time in weeks, a movement he had once done without thinking. He grabbed a basketball with his right hand and spun it on his fingers. The object that had always been a natural extension of his body now seemed alien, too heavy, too big. He tried to balance it on his palm for a few seconds, but frustration came quickly and violently. With a sudden motion, he threw the ball against the wall, knocking down a picture frame and provoking knocks on the ceiling of the downstairs neighbor. Then he simply stood still, breathing heavily, ashamed of his own loss of control. This was what he had become, a man who didn't recognize himself, unable even to coexist with the symbol of his professional identity. "I can't even do this anymore without breaking something," he thought as he picked up the shards of broken glass, careful not to cut his fingers. "Pathetic how my life has boiled down to avoiding further damage." Contact with the outside world had been limited to occasional visits from his agent, Jeff Austin, who brought groceries and unwanted updates from the franchise. It was Jeff who mentioned, with that exaggerated caution of one delivering bad news, that the deadline for the contract renewal had passed without any concrete offer from the Warriors. "They're waiting to see how you recover," he explained, unable to maintain eye contact. But Stephen knew the world of sports business too well to believe that polished version. He knew that behind the scenes his name was already being included in possible trade packages, his value dropping with every day of absence. The Warriors' silence was more eloquent than any official statement. The truth was as clear as it was painful. No one would bet on a player who spent more time recovering than on the court. Loneliness wasn't a temporary state. It was a harbinger of the oblivion awaiting discarded athletes. "Jeff, stop sugarcoating it," he interrupted the agent during his last visit, frustration spilling over in his voice. "They're not waiting for anything. They're just calculating how long it will take to replace me without seeming insensitive." The days dragged on in a monotonous routine of self-deprecation. Stephen slept poorly, ate worse, and avoided any contact with sports media, which would certainly be dissecting his latest injury as yet another evidence of his inadequacy for professional play. Social media, once a space for connection with fans, had become forbidden territory. He couldn't bear to see the disappointed comments, the merciless analyses, the comparisons with other more durable shooters. Occasionally, he forced himself to do the minimum recommended exercises for his ankle, always with the meticulous care of not moving the immobilized wrist. But every session ended with the same oppressive feeling of uselessness. Why bother when your body systematically conspired against you? Why persevere when the universe seemed determined to show, injury after injury, that you had chosen the wrong path? "Resisting for the sake of resisting isn't courage," he said to the blue bottle during one of those frustrating exercise sessions. "It's just stubbornness when all the evidence points to the same conclusion." On one particularly dark afternoon, as the fine rain battered the windows of his apartment, Stephen finally gave in to the impulse he had been repressing for days. He picked up the phone and called his father, Del Curry. The call was answered on the third ring, and the familiar voice of his father, that mixture of strength and kindness that had always guided him, was almost enough to break the emotional dam that held his tears in check. "Stephen, son, we were worried. Your mother tried to reach you several times." The genuine concern in his voice was palpable, even through the phone line. For a few seconds, Stephen couldn't respond, his throat tight with the knot of conflicting emotions. When he finally spoke, his voice came out hoarse, unrecognizable even to his own ears. "Dad, I think I made a mistake. I think I'm not cut out for this." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Del Curry, former NBA player, knew exactly the weight of those words coming from his son. It wasn't just a momentary crisis of confidence, it was a capitulation. "Stephen, listen carefully to what I'm going to say." Del's voice finally responded, each word deliberately paused. "You're not just my son. You're much better than I ever was, even at my best. Your body will heal. It's your mind that needs to resist now." That conversation should have been a turning point, a moment of reconnection with his roots and purpose. But after hanging up, Stephen felt even more isolated. It was easy for his father to talk about mental resilience. Del had had a solid career, without the devastating injuries that now threatened to turn his son into a footnote in NBA history. The well-meaning words only widened the gap between expectation and reality, between the player everyone expected him to be, and the broken man who looked at himself in the mirror each morning. That night, for the first time, Stephen allowed himself to seriously consider the possibility that had been haunting his mind like a ghost, asking for a trade. Perhaps a fresh start in a franchise with lower expectations could offer the space needed to rebuild his career, if there was still a career to save. The Warriors clearly no longer believed in him as the centerpiece of the team's future. Maybe it was time to accept this reality and seek an alternative path, before the decision was made without his participation. A new team, new expectations, new city, he thought, looking for the first time in days beyond the closed curtains, toward the distant lights of the city. Maybe it's the only dignified way out I have left. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:47 a.m. when the phone vibrated on the table, pulling Stephen out of a restless sleep full of dreams where he ran on endless courts, never reaching the basket. The sudden brightness of the screen in the dark room made him blink several times, confused. Who would be calling at this hour? The number wasn't saved in his contacts, just a string of digits with no identification. His first instinct was to ignore it, let it go to voicemail like all the other calls from the past days. But something, maybe the unusual time, maybe the exhaustion of chronic insomnia that lowered his defenses, made him slide his finger across the screen and answer. For several seconds, he heard only silence on the other end, punctuated by controlled breathing that indicated someone was definitely there, listening. Stephen sat up in bed, suddenly alert. "Who is it?" he asked, feeling an inexplicable restlessness spread through his body. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" The silence persisted for a few more moments before being broken by a deep, unmistakable voice. The same voice that had confronted him in the gym in Charlotte, the one that seemed to have the supernatural gift of appearing at the most critical moments of his life. Pain exposes what talent hides. Before Stephen could fully process what he had just heard, before he could formulate any response or question, the call was ended, leaving only the monotone tone of a dropped line echoing against his ear. He looked at the phone screen, stunned, as if the device had just performed an incomprehensible magic trick. Michael Jordan, again, appearing out of nowhere to leave yet another cryptic message and disappear. How had he gotten his number? How did he know exactly when to call? And more importantly, what the hell did that phrase mean? Stephen pushed the covers aside and got up, suddenly too restless to stay lying down. He walked to the window and opened the curtains for the first time in days, letting the pale light of the moon bathe the disordered room. "Pain exposes what talent hides," he repeated to himself, trying to decipher the meaning. What are my pains exposing beyond my fragility? What is Jordan seeing that I can't see? The night passed sleepless, with Stephen pacing the apartment like a caged animal, his mind buzzing with possible interpretations of the cryptic message. When the sun finally began to rise, painting the sky in Oakland with orange hues, he found himself staring at the blue UNC bottle. He picked it up and reread the message on the tape. "Resisting is rarer than shining." Then he took out the newspaper clipping he had received in Charlotte. "You don't need to be seen to be remembered." The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though still obscure. Jordan was trying to tell him something important enough to justify this mysterious effort to communicate. Perhaps the pains, physical and emotional, were indeed revealing something that easy success could never show. His true essence, his real capacity for perseverance, his character beyond talent. "And what if it's not about the broken body?" he murmured, a new perspective beginning to form in his mind. "What if it's about who I become through this break?" That revelation, though still partial, brought a subtle but noticeable change in his behavior in the following hours. Stephen opened all the curtains in the apartment, letting natural light flood every room. He took a long shower, shaved for the first time in weeks, and even made a full meal instead of just nibbling on processed foods. He put all the used dishes in the dishwasher, collected the accumulated trash, and organized the living room. Small acts of functionality that had become monumentally difficult during his depression now seemed not only possible, but necessary. There was no sudden euphoria or naive optimism, only the quiet determination of someone starting to see their situation in a different light. The injuries were still there. The career was still hanging by a thread. The Warriors were probably still considering options to replace him. But something fundamental had changed inside him. A shift in perspective that turned suffering from an unbearable burden into a possible path of transformation. "If pain is inevitable," he said aloud, testing the new philosophy, "maybe I can choose what it reveals about me rather than letting others decide." The phone rang again at 11:23 a.m. This time the caller ID showed Jeff Austin's name. Stephen hesitated for only a second before answering, surprised by his own willingness to reconnect with the outside world. Something in Jeff's voice immediately triggered an alarm, that artificially casual tone that bearers of bad news always try to adopt but never quite manage. "Stephen, how are you today? Did you sleep better?" The agent started, clearly avoiding the real purpose of the call. "Jeff, no beating around the bush. What happened?" Stephen interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh that carried the weight of unpleasant information. "I got a call from the Warriors management this morning," Jeff finally said, each word carefully measured. "They, well, there's no easy way to say this. They offered you in a trade package." Stephen felt the impact of the words like a physical punch to the stomach, but he remained silent, waiting for the full details that he knew would come. "3 rookies and you for an established power forward," Jeff continued, his voice now stripped of any pretense of casualness. "They tried with 3 different teams in the last 48 hours. The silence that followed was deafening. Stephen clenched the phone tightly, his fingertips white with tension. Even in his most pessimistic scenarios, even during the darkest nights of self-deprecation, he had never imagined that his devaluation would be so complete, so humiliating. Offered as dead weight alongside inexperienced rookies, as a dispensable item in a bigger deal. It was the definitive confirmation of everything he had feared, the materialization of his most recurring nightmares. Yet something in the way Jeff had phrased the sentence, "they tried," sparked a curiosity that pierced through the fog of despair for a moment. "What do you mean by tried?" he asked, his voice almost unrecognizable. "The trade didn't happen?" Another silence. Longer this time. When Jeff finally responded, there was something new in his voice, a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief that Stephen had never detected before. "That's where it gets complicated," the agent elaborated hesitantly. "They offered you in a trade for 3 rookies, and the worst part, no team accepted." The visitors' locker room at the Pepsi Center in Denver had that peculiar feeling of all NBA opponents' locker rooms: impersonal, functional, and vaguely hostile. Stephen watched the digital clock on the wall mark exactly 38 minutes until Game 3 of the playoff series against the Nuggets. His teammates were preparing around him, each immersed in their own pregame routine. Jarrett Jack meticulously adjusted his socks to the exact height he considered appropriate. Klay Thompson, with headphones isolating him from the world, executed precise stretches. Andrew Bogut applied another layer of pain relief spray to his problematic elbow. The strong smell of the product mixed with the familiar aroma of liniment, sweat, and anxiety. No one was talking about what was really at stake, the chance to make history. With the series tied at 1-1, this third game represented the decisive moment, especially after Stephen's explosion in the previous game, where his 30 points and 13 assists had secured the first playoff victory in the careers of several of those players. The media exploded with enthusiastic headlines. Analysts quickly revised their predictions, and suddenly the name Curry was in every conversation about the postseason. The transformation had been as swift as it was surprising. Just 4 months earlier, he had been considered dispensable, damaged beyond repair. A player that no team had wanted in a trade, not even as a bonus in a bigger package. Now, after his full recovery and an impressive string of games at the end of the regular season, he found himself at the center of an unexpected storm of attention, and it terrified him. "Redemption stories sell well until the next failure," he murmured to himself as he tied his shoes with the obsessive precision he had developed. "They're just waiting for me to fail again to confirm what they have always believed." The weight of that newly discovered expectation was almost as oppressive as the previous rejection. Stephen could still taste the bitterness of that revelation months ago. No team accepted, like a final sentence on his worth. The road back had been arduous, solitary, and non-linear. Every small injury, every setback in the rehabilitation process, every internal doubt had to be overcome without the external validation that so many athletes took for granted. Jordan's enigmatic words during that sleepless night had slowly transformed into a personal mantra: "Pain exposes what talent hides." He had begun to understand that his physical fragilities had forced him to develop aspects of his game that would likely have remained dormant if his body had cooperated from the start. The obsessive precision in his shooting to compensate for the lack of athletic explosiveness, the sharp court vision as an alternative to pure speed, the ability to find impossible angles when the obvious paths were blocked. The 2012 to 2013 regular season had become a laboratory where Stephen silently rebuilt not only his body, but his playing style, adapting, evolving, transforming limitations into badges. And now here he was, starring in his first playoff series, carrying the weight of expectations that violently swung between extremes. They don't know what happened during those months, he thought, quickly glancing at the small scar on his left wrist, a permanent reminder of the fall. No one knows what it's like to rebuild from the ashes when everyone has already written your obituary. Coach Mark Jackson walked into the locker room with the energy and presence that characterized him. A former point guard, Jackson had a deep understanding of the unique pressures Stephen faced in that position. From the beginning, he had shown almost a religious faith in Curry's potential when most analysts and executives saw him as too risky of a bet. "Gentlemen," Jackson began with his preacher-like resonant voice, "we are exactly where we always knew we would be. No one outside this locker room believed, but that never mattered. We knew." His eyes briefly fixed on Stephen, transmitting a silent message of trust. To Jackson, Curry's evolution wasn't a surprise, but the realization of a vision he had stubbornly held while others doubted. The players formed a circle around their coach, the electricity of the moment amplified by the respectful silence. Jackson continued, detailing specific tactical adjustments to neutralize the altitude advantage of Denver, emphasizing the importance of defense in the first few minutes. Stephen absorbed every word, but part of his mind remained fixated on one question. What if the magic from the last game didn't repeat itself? What if the shot didn't fall today? What if the story of his brilliant career, interrupted by injuries, was just briefly diverted, not truly rewritten? "Curry," Jackson's voice pulled him from his thoughts, "you're our thermometer today. When your game heats up, the whole team catches fire. Remember that when the ball is in your hands." "Got it, coach," Stephen responded automatically, while internally a voice whispered, "What if I cool down at the wrong moment? What if the thermometer breaks?" The tunnel leading to the court seemed particularly long that night, like a corridor narrowing to an impossible escape point. Stephen could feel the roar of the crowd reverberating through the concrete, sound waves transformed into physical vibrations under his feet. Denver was known as one of the most hostile arenas in the league. The combination of altitude that battered the lungs of visiting teams and passionate fans created a perfect storm for opponents. As he walked with his teammates, Stephen performed his personal, almost superstitious routine. 3 taps on his chest, a touch on his wrist scar, and the silent repetition of the words that had guided his recovery. The packed stands exploded in boos as the Warriors emerged for warm-ups. The blue and yellow of the visiting jerseys dramatically contrasted with the predominance of sky blue from the local fans. While performing familiar warm-up drills, progressively longer shots, finishes near the basket, simulations of game situations, Stephen felt his legs heavier than usual, the thinner air punishing his lungs. Denver was over 1,600 meters above sea level, and even professional athletes like him felt the impact of that altitude. In the previous game in Oakland, his body had responded with almost supernatural precision, as if every injury, every healing, every painful adaptation had been merely preparation for that specific moment. But here, under the intense lights of the Pepsi Center, with thousands of hostile fans shouting his name with scorn, Stephen felt a familiar hesitation settle into his muscles. "It's different here," Klay Thompson commented at his side, also feeling the effects of the altitude during warm-ups. "Feels like we're playing with weighted vests." "It's not the altitude that weighs," Stephen replied, shooting a three-pointer and watching the ball bounce off the rim. "It's the expectations that suffocate more than the thin air." The first few minutes of the game passed in a blur of intensity. Denver came out aggressive, using the altitude advantage to impose a frenetic pace that was punishing the Warriors' lungs. Ty Lawson, the explosive point guard for the Nuggets, relentlessly attacked the paint, repeatedly testing Stephen's mobility on defense. The switches left Curry often isolated against larger, stronger opponents. Iguodala, Chandler, even the powerful Kenneth Faried, who shoved, bumped, and exploited every inch of physical advantage allowed by the rules, and some beyond them. Sweat cascaded down Stephen's face, his shirt already soaked before the first timeout. Offensively, he struggled to find space. The Nuggets had clearly studied his performance from the last game and adjusted their defense to deny him exactly the spots on the court where he had caused the most damage. 2, sometimes 3, sky blue jerseys converged on him whenever he received the ball beyond the three-point line. At halftime, with the Warriors surprisingly up by 3 points, Stephen sat on the bench in the locker room examining a bruise that was beginning to form on his right forearm, the result of a particularly physical battle for a loose ball. "They're trying to intimidate you, Steph," David Lee observed, applying ice to his own injured shoulder. "It's actually a sign of respect. They're scared of what you did in the last game. Or maybe they've realized I'm the weakest link defensively," Stephen replied, flexing his fingers to make sure the impact hadn't affected his sensitivity. Testing if I'll break under pressure, like they always have. The third quarter brought a change in momentum. The Nuggets, fueled by the frenetic energy of their fans, opened up a 13-2 run in the first 4 minutes. The ball seemed unwilling to cooperate with the Warriors, bouncing off the rim on normally reliable shots, slipping from hands that were usually secure. Stephen felt that familiar drowning sensation, as if every mistake, every lost possession, was another confirmation of the impending failure. His right ankle, the same one that had undergone multiple surgeries, began to throb, not necessarily from any new damage, but as a psychosomatic reminder of the weaknesses that had always accompanied him. Jackson noticed the growing hesitation in his point guard and called a timeout, pulling Stephen aside for a private conversation while the other players gathered around the assistant coach. "Look at me, Steph," Jackson commanded, holding him firmly by the shoulders. "You're allowed to fail. What you're not allowed to do is doubt. Shoot like every ball is the last one that will ever touch your hands." "Coach, they completely adjusted the defense," Stephen replied, his breath still heavy from the altitude and effort. "I'm not finding the same spaces, and when I do, the ball just isn't falling." The final minutes of the third quarter and the start of the last period were a battle of trenches. Every possession was contested as if the entire championship depended on that single moment. The lead swung back and forth. 2 points for Denver, a tie, 3 points for Golden State, tie again. Stephen began to find his rhythm once more, not with the spectacular three-pointers that had defined the previous game, but with precise passes, timely drives, and most importantly, a renewed determination on defense. With exactly 4:32 left in the game, the Warriors were ahead by 2 points, but the Pepsi Center buzzed with the palpable tension of 18,000 people who knew they were witnessing a defining moment. That's when Ty Lawson, exploiting a switch, isolated himself against Stephen on the perimeter. What followed was a series of almost hypnotic movements. Low dribbles, direction changes, Lawson's body leaning left as the ball seemed glued to his right hand. Stephen maintained his defensive stance, his eyes fixed on his opponent's waist as he'd been taught from the first practices, but his feet felt like they were made of concrete. Lawson found the exact space he was looking for and rose for a mid-range jumper that only touched the net. "That's how a real point guard plays under pressure, glass boy," Lawson taunted as they moved back to the other side of the court, loud enough for only Stephen to hear. "Tough it out or go back to the infirmary." "We still have 4 minutes," Stephen replied automatically, but the comment hit its intended target, the insecurity that had always followed him since the injuries. The score remained tight until the final minute, when a series of defensive mistakes by the Warriors allowed Denver to open a 5-point lead with only 47 seconds on the clock. Golden State called a timeout. In the huddle, Jackson drew up a play designed to create a clean 3-point shot, exactly the type of situation Stephen had dominated in the previous game. The play worked perfectly in execution. Successive screens freed Curry in the right corner, his favorite spot beyond the arc. The ball arrived exactly where it was supposed to. Stephen rose in a fluid motion, his shooting mechanics so perfect it looked like a tutorial. The entire arena seemed to freeze in that suspended moment. Defenders too late to contest, teammates already positioning themselves for the next defensive play, fans with their hands on their heads in anticipation. But something microscopic, imperceptible perhaps to everyone except Stephen himself, happened in the last millisecond. An almost invisible hesitation, a tiny contraction of the wrist that had been broken and rebuilt. The ball hit the inner rim, spun as if considering falling, and then crossed and went out. Missed shot. Denver grabbed the rebound, committed the necessary foul, and converted the free throws. The game was practically decided. "Perfect shot, wrong result," Jackson comforted him during the final timeout, the defeat already nearly confirmed. "That's how basketball works sometimes. We go home and protect our court next time." "Perfect shot?" Stephen thought, unable to verbalize his frustration. "A perfect shot goes in. I hesitated. I doubted. I failed." The locker room after the loss had that heavy atmosphere of a wasted opportunity. The players moved in silence, each processing the defeat in their own way. Some already mentally ready for the next game, others still stuck in the pivotal moments that had slipped away. Stephen felt the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation. He knew the criticisms were already being formulated on sports shows, in specialized columns, on social media. Curry's Game 2 performance was just an isolated flash. Warriors squander a golden chance with a wrong game-winning shot. Curry's inconsistency haunts Golden State again. Sitting in front of his locker, Stephen slowly removed his ankle braces, the soaked socks, the sneakers that felt like they weighed a ton. His whole body ached, not just from the physical effort, but from that particular exhaustion that comes from deep disappointment. Jackson passed briefly, squeezing his shoulder in a silent gesture of support before heading off to interview with the press. The assistant coaches distributed instructions for the return flight to Oakland, treatment schedules, and plans for the following day. The routine continued, relentless, indifferent to the individual emotional storms. "Some days the ball just doesn't go in," offered Jarrett Jack, sitting in the locker next to him, trying to ease the obvious tension. "You had good shots, proper execution. Sometimes that's all it is." "It's not about the ball going in or not," Stephen replied, staring at the tile floor beneath his feet. "It's about trusting that it will go in when you need it most." I hesitated, Jack. For half a second, I hesitated. Stephen was one of the last to leave the locker room. He preferred to wait until most of the reporters had dispersed, until the cameras were focused on other stories. He put on his team jacket, the same one with the Warriors logo embroidered over the heart, and zipped it up to his neck, as if seeking some symbolic protection from the outside world. That's when he felt something strange in his right pocket, something that definitely wasn't there when he put on the jacket before the game. His fingers found what seemed to be a small folded card or note. Quickly looking around to make sure he was alone, Stephen took the object from his pocket. It was a hotel card, more specifically from the Four Seasons Denver, with the elegant logo embossed on the front. Turning it over, he found a handwritten message on the back, the now familiar handwriting making his heart race. "Courage is not consistency, it's repetition." There was no signature, but Stephen didn't need one. The pattern was clear now. Charlotte, Oakland, the mysterious call in the early hours, and now this. Someone, Jordan, was not only following his career, but his most vulnerable moments, appearing exactly when doubts threatened to consume everything. "How does he always know?" Stephen murmured, carefully placing the card back in his pocket. "How does he manage to be there without ever being physically here?" The message reverberated in his mind as he walked through the inner corridors of the arena towards the team bus. Courage is not consistency, it's repetition. It wasn't about getting it right every time. It wasn't about never failing or doubting. It was about continuing to shoot, continuing to believe, even when recent evidence suggested failure. It was about the willingness to try again, and again, and again, knowing that each attempt carried the risk of public disappointment. Consistency, that perfect and unwavering performance, was a myth, an unrealistic expectation that paralyzed even the most talented. True courage was in the repetition, in constant vulnerability, in the willingness to expose oneself to failure repeatedly in the pursuit of that transcendent moment. Stephen felt something shifting inside him, not a dramatic revelation, but a subtle shift in perspective, like a telescope finally finding the right focus. "I'm trying to understand, MJ," he thought, as if he could communicate telepathically with his invisible mentor. "I'm trying to see what you see in me that I can't fully see in myself." As he approached the side exit of the arena, where the team bus awaited, Stephen could hear the familiar buzz of reporters conducting their post-game broadcasts. Normally, he would have taken an alternate route to avoid the confrontation, but something in the newly discovered message propelled him forward. Repetition required facing, not avoiding. He turned the corner and immediately spotted a small group of reporters, 3 or 4, with microphones and portable cameras, likely wrapping up reports for the local sports news. They didn't notice him immediately, which allowed Stephen to overhear snippets of their unfiltered analysis. One particularly emphatic reporter, from a station Stephen didn't recognize, gestured animatedly as he spoke to the camera. Clearly overestimated after one impressive performance. When the pressure increased today, We saw the real Stephen Curry, hesitant, inconsistent, unable to lead in crucial moments. It was luck. He doesn't have the leader profile. The Warriors urgently need to reconsider their strategy if they want to advance in these playoffs. The words hit Stephen like physical blows, each sentence confirming exactly the fears that had been haunting him. He considered turning around, seeking another exit, protecting himself from that verbal assault. But something in the message on the card, courage is not consistency, it's repetition, kept him grounded. It was then that one of the other reporters noticed his presence, and suddenly all the cameras turned in his direction. Flashes went off, microphones were extended, and the same journalist who had just described him as overestimated now smiled politely. Professional hypocrisy on full display. Stephen felt his body tense, every muscle prepared for confrontation or flight, but he maintained the neutral expression he had perfected over the years of public scrutiny. "Stephen, a few moments, please," called the reporter, quickly moving to intercept him. "Just a few quick questions for our viewers." "Sure," he responded automatically, years of public relations training taking over. "But I need to be brief, the bus is waiting." The reporter positioned himself, the camera adjusted its focus, and the red light indicated they were live. The first question was about tactical adjustments for the next game, followed by a pedantic analysis of Denver's defense. Stephen answered mechanically, prefabricated phrases that wouldn't reveal anything significant. It was then that the reporter, sensing he was losing the opportunity for a viral moment, launched the question he had clearly planned from the start. Sharp as an arrow and designed to provoke an emotional reaction that could be replicated in sports programs across the country. "Steph, do you feel that your career has already peaked?" he fired, a barely disguised predatory smile. After the extraordinary game followed by this mediocre performance, many analysts are questioning whether you have what it takes to maintain a high level consistently. How do you respond to that? The question hung in the air like toxic smoke. Stephen could feel the heat rising in his neck, the indignation bubbling in his chest. For a moment, he visualized answering with all the accumulated anger from years of doubts, criticisms, and underestimation. He could almost savor the momentary satisfaction that would come from putting that reporter in his place, listing all the obstacles he had overcome just to be here, competing in the playoffs when so many had prematurely written his professional obituary. But then, like a beacon in the storm, the words on the card illuminated his thoughts. Courage is not consistency, it's repetition. The real test wasn't proving anything to this reporter or any critic. The real test was continuing to come back, continuing to try, continuing to believe, even when the external narrative insisted on defining him by his most recent failures. The underground parking lot of the Chase Center was almost completely empty, the oppressive silence amplifying every small sound, the distant drip of a pipe, the low hum of fluorescent lights, Stephen Curry's uneven breathing. 3 years had passed since that night in Denver. 3 years that had transformed a promising point guard into a global superstar. 3 years that culminated in the most painful defeat of his career. Sitting at the wheel of his black Range Rover, Stephen remained motionless, his hands still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the knuckles were white, the engine off, the world around him seeming disconnected from reality. The pain in his chest was physical, a constant pressure that made every breath a conscious effort. The numbers danced in his mind with cruel clarity. 3-1. Never in NBA Finals history had a team lost after leading 3-1. Never, until now, until him. Outside, Oakland still reverberated with the impact of the defeat. Occasional honks from cars with Cavaliers flags, distant cheers from visiting fans who had taken to the city's streets. Inside the car, the silence was interrupted only by the occasional sound of messages arriving on the phone, abandoned on the passenger seat. Probably his wife, his agent, teammates, all wondering why he had disappeared so quickly after the final whistle. Ignoring the mandatory press conference, evading the cameras, the questions, the stares. 73 wins in the regular season, he murmured to the empty parking lot, his voice trembling almost unrecognizably. The greatest record of all time, and I turned it into the biggest joke in NBA history. The nausea that had accompanied him since the final moments of the game, Since the moment Kyrie Irving made that three-point shot over his defense, since his own decisive shot had ricocheted off the rim, suddenly intensified. Stephen slammed the car door open with a jerky motion, barely managing to get out before doubling over onto the cold concrete. His whole body contracted in violent spasms as he emptied his stomach, involuntary tears streaming down his face, mingling with the cold sweat that covered his forehead. There was no one to witness this moment of complete vulnerability. He had specifically instructed his security to leave him alone, assuring them he would find his way home. Now kneeling on the concrete in the parking lot, tasting the bitter bile, Stephen Curry, unanimous MVP, three-point shooting record holder, supposedly the face of the future of the NBA, felt smaller and more insignificant than at any other moment since those early injuries that almost ended his career before it had even begun. The contrast was almost unbearable, from the near-forced retirement to the top of the world, and now this, a fall so public, so complete, it seemed to nullify every achievement, every record, every moment of glory from the past years. Maybe they were right from the start, he thought, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. Maybe I was never good enough to carry this weight. Leaning against the car, Stephen slowly returned to the driver's seat, shutting the door with a dull thud that echoed through the empty parking lot. The defeat in the finals wasn't just a sporting result. It was an identity collapse. Over the last 3 years, he had completely rebuilt his self-image, from a fragile, doubtful player to a revolutionary of the game, someone who defied conventions, who inspired a new generation of athletes to believe that size and brute strength weren't the only paths to greatness. His meteoric rise hadn't been just personal validation, but a kind of silent revenge against everyone who doubted him, everyone who had discarded him, everyone who had offered his name in trades no one accepted. And now, on the biggest stage possible, when history was literally within his grasp, he had failed. Not just failed, but had a collapse like no other. The critics, who had always questioned whether his style of play could win championships, now had their definitive proof. The statistics told a ruthless story. His performance in the finals was far below his regular season numbers. Precisely when his team needed his magic the most, it had simply vanished. 4 points in the fourth quarter of the decisive game, he whispered, the words burning his throat like acid. 4 damn points when everything was on the line. With mechanical movements almost disconnected from his consciousness, Stephen started the car. The engine hummed softly, contrasting with the emotional storm inside him. He needed to go home, face his family, find some way to explain the inexplicable, how the greatest regular season in history had ended in the most painful of defeats. How would he face his children? How would he look into his father's eyes, Del Curry, who had sacrificed so much for him to have this opportunity? How would he go back into a locker room next fall, trying to inspire confidence in teammates who had seen him fail at the most critical moment? Somewhere deep in his mind, Stephen knew there was a possible rationalization. Bogut's injury history, Green's suspension in Game 5 that had completely shifted the momentum of the series, his own undisclosed physical problems, minor injuries that affected his explosiveness and agility. But in this moment, wrapped in the hermetic cocoon of his car in the underground parking lot, such explanations seemed nothing more than pathetic excuses. The truth, in his pain-distorted perception, was much simpler and more devastating. He wasn't big enough. Not physically, not mentally, not spiritually. When history called, Stephen Curry didn't answer. They'll say it was a statistical anomaly, he thought, resting his head on the steering wheel. But I know the truth. I'm the anomaly. I never should have come this far. The phone on the passenger seat vibrated once more, the screen briefly lighting up the dark interior of the vehicle. Stephen ignored it, unable to face any human interaction at that moment. Instead, he adjusted the rearview mirror and stared at his own reflection. Red eyes, pale face, the image of a man unrecognizable to himself. It was then that he noticed something in the reflection that shouldn't have been there, a rectangular object in the back seat. He furrowed his brow, twisting his body to look directly. It was a box, a polished black wooden box, elegantly crafted, about the size of a large book, positioned precisely in the center of the back seat. Stephen froze, confusion momentarily overtaking even the pain of defeat. That box had definitely not been there when he entered the car after the game. No one but him had access to this vehicle. No one except... A sudden realization hit him like a physical wave. The previous messages, scattered throughout crucial moments of his career, came back to his mind in quick flashes. The gym in Charlotte, the water bottle at the rehab clinic, the card in the locker room in Denver. Always in moments of greatest vulnerability, always when giving up seemed like the only logical option. "It's impossible," he murmured, slowly turning toward the mysterious box. "How does he always know? How does he always find a way to me?" With trembling hands, Stephen turned off the engine again and moved to the back seat. The box was heavier than it first seemed, made of dark wood with metal details around the edges. There was no lock, just a simple hinge holding the lid closed. Taking a deep breath, as though about to dive into unknown waters, Stephen opened the box. The interior was lined with dark red velvet, creating an elegant contrast with the two objects carefully placed inside. An old wristwatch, apparently made of gold, with a black leather strap and a folded white card. Stephen picked up the card first, unfolding it with nearly reverential care. The familiar handwriting, those distinct strokes he had seen on newspaper clippings, sticky notes and hotel cards, made his heart race. 6 words, simple and direct. "Defeats don't defeat heroes. They refine them." "Refine," he repeated aloud, the word echoing in the confined space of the vehicle. How can something so devastating refine anything but failure? The clock in the box seemed like a piece from another time. Elegant, substantial, with a classic dial protected by slightly domed glass. It was not ostentatious like the modern pieces many athletes collected. It had the authenticity of something that had truly been used, truly valued. Stephen picked it up carefully, feeling its comforting weight in his palm. He turned it over to examine the back of the case, and his heart almost stopped. There, engraved in delicate letters, were the initials that confirmed all his suspicions. MJ. This was not just any old watch. It was a watch that had belonged to Michael Jordan. A personal item from the greatest player of all time, deliberately left for him at his moment of greatest despair. Stephen felt an overwhelming emotion take over his body. Not just the continuation of his previous pain, but something new, something complex that he could not fully name. It was as if, through that object, a direct line of communication had been established between him and the man who defined excellence in basketball. "He's watching. He always has been watching," he murmured, spinning the watch between his fingers. "And yet, he's not disappointed in me." This revelation hit him with surprising force. The fact that Jordan, the man known for his relentless standard of excellence, his almost pathological competitiveness, his absolute intolerance of failure, was sending not criticisms or condemnations, but a message of resilience and continuity, was almost incomprehensible. Defeats don't defeat heroes. They refine them. This was not empty consolation. Coming from Jordan, it was a declaration of faith, a faith that, at that very moment, Stephen could not find within himself. The tears he had fought to hold back all night finally spilled over, not in dramatic sobs, but in a quiet, steady flow that seemed to drain something toxic from his system. With the watch firmly grasped in one hand and the card in the other, Stephen Curry, the man who had transformed basketball with his almost supernatural shooting ability, finally allowed himself to feel the full extent of his defeat, no longer as a final sentence, but as part of a larger journey that was still unfolding. "Why me?" he asked the watch, as if the object could transmit the question to its former owner. "Of all the players, of all the possible stories, why did you choose mine to accompany?" The answer, of course, did not come. Only the silence of the empty parking lot and the soft ticking of the old watch, marking seconds that gradually turned the present into the past, defeat into history. Stephen wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket, drying his tears as he tried to reorganize his thoughts. The abyss of despair that had threatened to swallow him moments earlier had not disappeared completely, but it now seemed less infinite, less definitive. The pain of defeat remained, The public failure still weighed on his shoulders like concrete, but something had fundamentally changed in his perception. He looked again at the card, mentally reviewing all the previous messages. You don't need to be seen to be remembered. Resisting is rarer than shining. Pain exposes what talent hides. Courage is not constancy, it's repetition. And now defeats don't defeat heroes. They refine them. Together they form not just isolated pieces of advice, but a coherent philosophy. A philosophy that challenged the simplistic narrative of success and failure that dominated modern sports discourse. He's not trying to save me from failure, Stephen realized, a sudden clarity lighting up his mind. He's teaching me to use failure as a tool, just as he did. The revelation brought with it a wave of memories, not of his own recent failures, but of stories about Jordan that he had heard and read over the years. The high school team cut, the years of losses to the Pistons before finally overcoming them, the first retirement and the return, the struggles in baseball. Each chapter of Michael Jordan's legend contained not just triumphs, but monumental failures that were deliberately incorporated into the larger narrative, transformed not into points of shame, but into essential fuel for what came afterward. Stephen realized with a clarity that only extreme pain could provide that he was being called to do the same, not to hide or minimize this devastating defeat, but to allow it to refine him, strengthen him, prepare him for a comeback he still could not fully envision. With reverential care, Stephen placed the watch on his left wrist, adjusting the worn leather strap. The object seemed strangely fitting there, as if it had found its destiny after a long journey. The card he folded again and carefully placed in the pocket of his shirt, close to his heart. If he believes I can rise from this, he murmured, looking at the watch on his wrist, then I should at least try. Moving back to the driver's seat, Stephen started the car again. His phone now displayed dozens of missed calls and unread messages, but the anxiety that had once consumed him had significantly diminished. He was not ready to face the outside world, the questioning, the ruthless analyses, the expressions of false sympathy and genuine disappointment. But at least now he felt capable of driving home, of facing his family, of starting the long process of acceptance and eventually rebirth. It was then that a firm knock on the driver's side window jerked him violently from his thoughts. Stephen turned his head, startled, to find the familiar face of Marcus, one of the night security guards at the Chase Center, leaning toward the glass with an expression of apology mixed with urgency. Lowering the window, Stephen struggled to compose a neutral expression, aware of his still red eyes and face marked by recent tears. Sorry for the inconvenience, Stephen, Marcus started hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable interrupting what he perceived to be an extremely private moment. I know you asked not to be disturbed, but... It's fine, Marcus, Stephen interrupted, his voice still hoarse from earlier emotion and nausea. What is it? The security guard looked away briefly, as if contemplating the best way to convey the information. When he looked back at Stephen, there was something in his expression, a peculiar mix of respect and astonishment, that immediately captured the player's full attention. Stephen, there's someone waiting for you at the east entrance, Marcus finally said, the words coming out with a carefully measured cadence. He said he won't leave until he talks to you. That night in 2016, when Stephen Curry slowly drove to the east entrance of the Chase Center, his heart raced with the possibility of who might be waiting for him. The words of the security guard echoed in his mind. He said he won't leave until he talks to you. As he turned the corner of the building, his headlights illuminated a solitary figure, tall, imposing, unmistakable even from a distance. Michael Jordan himself, no longer an invisible presence through messages and objects, but physically there, waiting in the shadows. The encounter that followed lasted less than 15 minutes but sealed a pact between them. Jordan said little, placed a hand on Stephen's shoulder, and simply said, Now you're ready for the second part of your story. Defeat isn't the end, it's just the beginning of true greatness. They never publicly mentioned this meeting until today. 9 years later, the auditorium of the Curry Foundation in Charlotte shone under strategically placed lights, creating a warm atmosphere despite the grandeur of the space. Rows of chairs arranged in concentric semicircles accommodated an eclectic mix of journalists, young athletes from charitable programs, corporate sponsor executives, and local families. Banners featuring photographs of smiling children and statistics on community impact decorated the side walls, while on the main stage, a simple dark wooden podium displayed the foundation's discreet logo, a stylized silhouette of a child shooting a basketball toward a star. Stephen Curry, now 37, observed the audience from the side of the stage, partially hidden by a thick curtain. He wore an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, no tie, a deliberate choice to keep the event formal, but not overly ceremonial. His fingers idly played with the watch on his left wrist, the same old watch he had found in the backseat of his car 9 years earlier, after the devastating loss in the 2016 finals. The object had become his talisman, his tangible connection to the man who had silently shaped his journey at its most critical moments. This watch has seen more basketball history than any arena ever built, he thought, running his finger over the slightly scratched glass. And today, its story will finally be told. The event that evening was officially the annual fundraising ceremony for the Curry Foundation's educational and sports programs. The carefully planned schedule included speeches from corporate partners, presentations from young beneficiaries, and would culminate in the announcement of the funds raised for the next cycle of projects. But Stephen had decided after weeks of contemplation that this evening would also mark another kind of revelation, one he had kept hidden for over a decade. The event host, a well-known sports journalist from Charlotte, was now concluding the formal introduction, recapping the foundation's achievements over the past year and the extraordinary journey of its founder. Stephen heard his name called and, taking a deep breath, walked to the center of the stage amidst warm applause. He smiled, waved briefly, and took his place behind the podium. His eyes methodically scanned the audience before settling on a specific spot in the back rows, a figure partially shadowed, wearing a discreet cap and sunglasses even indoors. Stephen felt a wave of almost overwhelming emotion. He came. Despite all the uncertainties, despite the risk of public exposure, he really came. "Thank you, Charlotte, for always showing your love," he began, his soft voice amplified by the microphones. "It's always special to return to where it all began, where the first basket seemed impossibly high for a scrawny kid with dreams bigger than his body." The initial speech followed the pre-prepared script: formal thanks, statistics about the reach of the programs, recognition of the partners present. But about 10 minutes later, Stephen paused abruptly. His hands, usually steady even under the pressure of game-winning moments, now trembled slightly as he pulled a small yellowed card from his suit's inner pocket. The audience, sensing the shift in tone and body language, fell into an expectant silence. When Stephen spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, more intimate, more vulnerable, as if suddenly the conversation had shifted from institutional to deeply personal. "Today, I'd like to momentarily interrupt our official schedule," he announced, holding up the yellowed card so the audience could see it, "because there's a story I've never publicly told, a story about fragility, doubt, and the rarest form of mentorship an athlete could receive." An electric tension ran through the auditorium. Journalists straightened in their seats, cameras were repositioned, smartphones emerged from pockets and bags. Whatever was coming next clearly wasn't part of the official event schedule or the press releases distributed earlier. Stephen looked once more at the partially hidden figure in the back rows, as if seeking silent permission. There was no visible movement in response, but something in the man's posture, an almost imperceptible nod, seemed to communicate approval. "In 2011, during the NBA lockout, I was at the lowest point of my career," Stephen continued, his voice now carrying the weight of painful memories. "My ankle had been operated on repeatedly, and after each surgery came the same doubt. Was my body simply not made for this game? Had all the work, all the sacrifice, been for nothing?" In the front rows, Dell and Sonia Curry watched with expressions that blended surprise and contained emotion. This was not a story that Stephen easily shared, even with his family. The details of his near give-up were known only to an extremely small circle. In the auditorium, the silence was almost tangible, as hundreds of people collectively held their breath, while one of the greatest basketball players in history exposed his deepest vulnerabilities. It was in this moment, at my lowest point, that I received the first message, Stephen revealed, lifting the yellowed card. In an empty gym in Charlotte, where I used to train with my dad when I was a kid, I found Michael Jordan training alone. Our conversation lasted less than 20 minutes, but it would change the course of my life forever. A murmur passed through the crowd like a wave. The name Jordan provoked immediate reactions. Necks stretching, eyes nervously scanning the room, whispers speeding up among journalists. Stephen continued, now pulling out a small envelope from the other pocket. After that meeting, I found this in my backpack, he explained, showing the worn envelope. An old newspaper clipping about me, with a handwritten message, "You don't need to be seen to be remembered." No signature, no explanation. Just those words that, in that specific moment, were exactly what I needed to hear. As he spoke, a large screen behind him lit up, displaying enlarged images of the items he was mentioning. The newspaper clipping, the UNC water bottle, the Denver hotel card, the note found in the jacket, culminating with a photograph of the old watch that now adorned his wrist. Each object told a part of the secret story that ran parallel to the public narrative of his career. Stephen methodically described each moment of intervention. Each message received precisely when giving up seemed like the only logical option. Each carefully chosen word that had sustained him through injuries, rejections, and devastating defeats. His voice oscillated between professional firmness and contained emotion, especially when detailing the night in the parking lot after the 2016 finals loss. For over 10 years, he finally said, his voice notably choked despite the visible effort to maintain composure. I received help from someone who never needed to show up, someone who had already won everything, but chose to help me without expecting applause. Michael Jordan wasn't just my idol. He was my invisible anchor. And I think the world deserves to know that now. The name spoken explicitly triggered an audible reaction in the audience. A mix of sighs, muffled exclamations, and the characteristic sound of dozens of cameras firing simultaneously. Stephen paused deliberately, allowing the full impact of the revelation to be absorbed. The story he had just shared completely challenged the established narrative about his career, his relationship with Jordan, and the very nature of rivalry and mentorship in professional sports. For years, the sports media had built narratives about generational distance, about Jordan's supposed reluctance to embrace his successors, about the need for each new star to kill their predecessors symbolically to establish their own legacy. And now, all at once, Stephen Curry had torn down those constructions, revealing a story of discreet mentorship that completely transcended public expectations. I kept this secret for so long because I believed it was something personal, something private between two athletes. He continued, his gaze now directly aimed at the figure in the back rows. But I've recently realized that stories like this need to be told, that vulnerability isn't weakness, that recognizing who helped us along the way doesn't diminish our achievements, but places them in a larger tapestry of human connection. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, as if every person present intuitively understood they were witnessing a moment that would be referenced, analyzed, and discussed for decades. Stephen removed the watch from his wrist and carefully held it between his fingers, the stage light reflecting softly on the aged metal. This watch belonged to Michael Jordan, he explained, his voice now more firm. He left it for me the night I almost gave up completely, after the most painful loss of my career. Along with it came a message. Defeats don't defeat heroes. They refine them. Words I carry with me every day since then. Turning directly to the back of the auditorium, Stephen did something no one expected. He extended his hand in an explicit gesture of invitation. Michael, if you're willing, I think it's time for this story to have its rightful ending. The entire audience seemed to move as a single organism, heads turning toward the back rows. For several seconds, nothing happened, and a palpable tension began to form in the air. Had Stephen really revealed something so extraordinary without the presence of the other protagonist? Then slowly, the figure in the back rows stood up. Michael Jordan, because it was undoubtedly him, even with the discreet cap and sunglasses now removed, began walking down the central aisle toward the stage. Recognition spread through the audience in concentric waves, like circles expanding on the surface of a lake after a stone's impact. First, the veteran sports journalists, then the young athletes who had grown up idolizing his legend, finally the general public. In seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, a spontaneous ovation growing in volume and intensity as Jordan, with that same confident, distinctive walk that defined his presence on the courts, advanced toward the stage. True recognition can only come after true vulnerability, Stephen thought, watching the iconic figure approach. Maybe it took all these years for me to finally be ready for both. When Jordan took the stage, the physical contrast between the two men couldn't have been more pronounced. Stephen with his light and agile frame, Jordan still imposing even at 62 years old. They met at the center, and to the surprise of the audience, and Stephen himself, Jordan wrapped him in a firm embrace. It wasn't a formal, ceremonial hug, the kind exchanged at events and ceremonies, but a genuine gesture that communicated a depth of connection rarely witnessed publicly between athletes from different generations, especially of the caliber of these two men. When they parted, Stephen handed the microphone to Jordan, who accepted it with an expression blending reluctance and resolve. The face of a notoriously private man who, for this single occasion, had decided to let the world glimpse a dimension of his personality that was usually inaccessible to public scrutiny. "I saw in him what no one else saw," Jordan simply said, his deep voice reverberating through the silent auditorium. "And I waited until he saw it too." The simplicity of the statement, contrasting with Jordan's legendary competitive eloquence, carried an authenticity that amplified its impact. It wasn't a prepared speech meant to impress or dominate, but a sincere acknowledgement of the potential he had identified in a hesitant young athlete, a potential that transcended physical limitations and conventional statistics. For a moment, Jordan seemed poised to elaborate, but then simply handed the microphone back to Stephen and took a step back, as if reminding everyone that, after all, this was Curry's story to tell. The moment of silence that followed contained more meaning than any elaborate speech could convey. It was the silence of an unprecedented passing of the torch, not just between players, but between entirely different approaches to the same game, between philosophies of excellence that, while contrasting in expression, shared the same core of transcendent dedication. "Today, April 24th, 2025, Stephen concluded, his voice now firm and clear, carrying the conviction of a man who had fully integrated all the dimensions of his journey. "I give back to the world what I received in silence. May every young talent know, sometimes your strength isn't in who sees you, but in who holds you up when no one else believes." When the applause finally erupted, it wasn't just for the surprising revelation or for the presence of two basketball legends on the same stage. It was for something more fundamental, more universally resonant. The recognition that even the greatest among us need, at critical moments, the guidance of others. That vulnerability and strength are not opposites, but complementary dimensions of the same journey. That sometimes the greatest demonstration of greatness lies not in the trophies raised under spotlights, but in the hands extended in the shadows when no one else is looking. Did you enjoy the story of Michael Jordan and Stephen Curry? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and don't miss the next video that's already waiting for you on the screen. I'll see you there. Oh, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you thought of the ending of the story.